I found her on the edge of the forest, right where the gravel road gave up and the moss-covered earth began to breathe on its own. The storm had passed 2 days earlier, leaving the woods damp and broken. Branches snapped like bones, the air still holding the scent of something unsettled. She couldn't have been more than 20 days old. Tiny, dirt-smeared, eyes barely open. Her fur was the color of smoke, matted and clinging to her frame like wet thread. No mother, no siblings, just Juniper, and the sound of her breathing, light and uneven like wind through pine needles. I didn't plan to stop, but something in me did. Something old. I used to be someone else, once. A vet student, a son, a boy who lost things he never got back. Holding her in my hands that morning, I didn't realize I'd just agreed to open a door I thought I'd nailed shut years ago. I wrapped her in the only clean thing I had in the truck, a faded flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of cedar and old rain. She didn't protest, didn't mewl, just trembled in that terrible hollow way that animals do when they've stopped hoping to be found. Her body, barely the length of my hand, was all brittle ribs and damp silence. I pressed her gently against my chest and stood there for a moment on the edge of the woods, unsure whether I was rescuing her or waking something in myself that had been better left asleep. The trees loomed like sentinels behind me, their trunks slick with the remnants of the storm, and the sky above hung low and gray, a lid pressing the world inward. My cabin was a 15-minute drive down a road that wound through the thickets like a scar. I kept glancing at her between shifts of the gear stick, half afraid she'd vanish if I took my eyes off her. She didn't. She just breathed, shallow, rapid, fragile, as though her entire being was made of soft glass. The heater in the truck barely worked, but I cranked it anyway, letting the dry, metallic warmth fill the cabin in uneven waves. I talked to her as I drove, not knowing why, maybe to fill the space between the ghost of who I was and the life I'd been avoiding for years. "You've got a fighter's name," I told her. "Juniper, like the tree. You don't break easy." When I finally laid her down on an old towel inside a cardboard box beside my fireplace, I realized I was shaking. Not from fear, no, not quite. From memory. From the sudden weight of a past that had arrived uninvited in a trembling kitten's body. Years ago, when I was still in vet school, there'd been another kitten, another rescue, a mistake that cost me everything. I pushed the thought away like a stone into deep water, but its ripple lingered in the corners of the room. I focused on the present, on her. I cleaned her gently with a warm cloth, wiping away the dirt and dried leaves that clung to her fur. Her eyes were gummed at the edges, crusted with something sticky and yellow, and her breathing wheezed faintly through her nostrils. I knew the signs. She was dehydrated, likely anemic and barely hanging on. I prepared a bottle with kitten formula, still had a case of them from when I thought I'd try again, and coaxed the nipple into her mouth. She didn't latch at first, but then, as if a switch flipped inside her, she sucked with a sudden, desperate energy, her tiny paws pushing at the bottle like she was trying to knead her way back into the world. That was the moment I felt it, a quiet, dangerous hope beginning to root itself in my chest, not just for her survival, but for something in me I didn't yet have the courage to name. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of care that felt both foreign and familiar, like brushing your fingers across a scar you'd forgotten you carried. Juniper slept in a woven basket beside the fireplace, nestled into a nest of soft flannel and fleece that I'd cobbled together from old clothes and one of my mother's quilts, the one with faded blue threadwork that used to hang in her hallway. Every 2 hours, even through the night, I warmed formula bottles and held her against my palm while she drank. She was still weak, her legs twitched when she tried to stand, and her head lolled sometimes, as if even the weight of thought was too much. But there was a fire in her now, a will stitched tightly into her fragile body. I started keeping notes, old habit. I wrote down every feeding time, every gram she gained, every odd cough or flicker of strength. I found myself talking out loud again, mostly to her, sometimes to the room, rarely to the shadows that still pressed at the edges of memory. I told her about the vet clinic I never finished school for, about the boy I was back then and how easily I'd believed that wanting to save something was the same as knowing how. I never expected to hear an answer. But one afternoon, as I sat with her curled in my palm, her belly rising and falling in a sleepy rhythm, there was a knock at the door. It was Marla Wren. She stood on the porch with her hood drawn and her mouth tight, holding a clipboard in one hand and a look of exhausted suspicion in the other. Word travels fast in a town like Black Hollow. She'd heard there was a kitten rescue happening, off the books, and protocol demanded she check in. I let her in without a word. She crouched beside the basket, eyes scanning Juniper with a practiced kind of gentleness. "She's young," she said, "way too young to be out alone. You sure there aren't others?" I told her no, though I wasn't sure. Something in her face hardened, not distrust exactly, but wariness. "If there's a colony, we need to find it. You keeping her?" she asked. I hesitated. That pause told her more than I wanted it to. Over coffee we talked, less about the kitten, more about what came after. Marla had seen enough abandoned litters and burned-out rescuers to know how things often ended. "Sometimes saving one means letting go of others," she said, her voice low, almost regretful. "You ready for that?" I said nothing, but something in me bristled. Juniper wasn't just a kitten anymore. She was becoming an anchor, pulling pieces of me back into place. But Marla's question lingered. Later that evening, when Juniper mewed for food and pressed her face against my fingers, I felt that tension rise again. What begins as rescue can easily become something more, something dangerous, if you're not honest about what you're trying to save. It was the third night after Marla's visit when the sound came, thin, distant, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. I'd just laid Juniper down in her makeshift nest after a feeding. She'd grown stronger. Her paws now kneaded the air when she fed, and her eyes, still cloudy, still too wide, followed me when I moved. But that sound pulled me to the door before I even realized I'd moved. I stepped outside into the cold hush of the trees. The sky was a blanket of cloud, moonless and low, and the forest seemed to breathe around me, creaking in its slow, ancient rhythm. Then I heard it again. A mule, not Juniper. This one was sharper, less steady. I followed it through the thicket behind the cabin, my boots crunching through damp leaves and broken branches until I found the old shed. I hadn't opened it in years, not since the flood that ruined half the tools inside and the memories I'd tried to leave buried. The door stuck. I forced it open with a grunt, and there, tucked into the corner beneath a pile of moldy tarp and forgotten plywood, were 3 kittens. All older than Juniper, maybe 6 or 7 weeks. Their eyes glinted in the dark, but only one moved. The others huddled close, scared or sick. I couldn't tell. And beside them, slumped awkwardly with her ribs showing and her breath shallow, was the mother cat. Still alive, barely. I stood there for a long moment, breath caught, brain racing. Had Juniper come from this litter? Had the storm scattered them? I hadn't even thought to check. Guilt rose like bile, thick, heavy, ugly. How could I have missed this? The forest wasn't just hiding the past. It was still alive with consequences. I gathered them, one by one. The mother didn't protest, though she let out a low, rattling growl when I reached beneath her. Her body was warm but limp. I carried them all inside and laid them on the rug near the fire. Juniper stirred in her basket as I moved past, her tiny face lifting toward the warmth of her newfound kin, unaware that her story had just become part of a much larger, messier web. I spent the rest of the night caring for the new arrivals, checking vitals, warming milk, wiping their small faces with a damp cloth. The mother cat was in rough shape, too thin, dehydrated, and her breathing was wrong. I gave her fluids and wrapped her in a towel, but I could feel the slow closing of a door behind her eyes. She wasn't going to make it. She'd held on just long enough to keep them alive. That was the twist no one warns you about in rescue work. Sometimes survival isn't a victory. It's an inheritance of someone else's unfinished fight. And suddenly, Juniper wasn't the only one I had to save. I wasn't just Elias anymore either. I was the reluctant heart of a fragile, growing family. By morning, the living room felt like a recovery ward, quiet, warm, dense with the smell of milk replacer, old wood smoke, and the faint iron-like tang of sickness. Juniper, oblivious to the change, slept curled in her basket. But the other 3, whom I began calling Birch, Sage, and Ash, were restless. They weren't used to human hands. Each touch made them flinch or hiss, their little bodies stiff as wire, eyes wide and watchful. They'd had their mother until the night before, and now everything. Every smell, every sound was unfamiliar. I understood that panic too well. Loss makes strangers out of the world. I called Marla, half expecting her to scold me for waiting. Instead, she sighed like someone who's seen this kind of story too many times to blame anyone. "You want me to come by?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. There was a part of me that still wanted this to be my mess to fix, some old instinct that said responsibility was the same thing as redemption. But I said yes. She arrived that afternoon with a crate of supplies and the kind of presence that fills a space without demanding it. As she knelt beside the fire and looked over the kittens, her face softened. "You've got yourself a proper little clan here," she muttered, gently checking their limbs and eyes, nodding to herself. "Sage has got an upper respiratory thing, might need meds. Birch is borderline malnourished. Ash, he's the fighter. That one's got attitude." She glanced toward Juniper, who had woken up and was watching from the basket with something like cautious curiosity. "And the little one?" "She's the reason any of this started," I said, quieter than I meant to. Marla gave me a look, not pitying, but knowing. "You ever think about what comes next, Elias? What happens when they're ready?" The question sat between us like a low hum, neither of us wanting to break it. I didn't answer, because the truth was, I hadn't. I was too busy reacting, bottle by bottle, breath by breath, to imagine what came after. Adoption? Fostering? Releasing them to a shelter? The thought of handing them over made something deep inside me twist, but the idea of keeping them all felt like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. Later, after Marla left, I sat on the floor with the kittens sleeping around me in uneven piles of fur and heat. The mother cat, whom I'd silently named Wren, had passed not long after sunrise. Quietly, without struggle, I buried her under the cedar tree behind the cabin, the same place I'd buried my dog years ago, and marked it with a smooth river stone. As night fell, I realized I was no longer the observer. These kittens weren't a rescue mission anymore. They were threads now, woven through my daily rhythms, pulling loose the parts of me I'd once hidden away. And maybe the scariest part wasn't losing them. Maybe it was what keeping them might force me to remember. 2 days after Wren's quiet burial, the quiet around the cabin began to unravel. It started with a voicemail, clipped, uncertain, left by someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. His voice cracked halfway through the message, like he hadn't quite decided whether he should be angry or sorry. "Elias, I heard from someone in Black Hollow that you're doing rescues again, that you've got a litter. I thought maybe you'd want to talk. You don't have to. Just call me back if you want." No name. He didn't need to leave one. I knew that voice the moment I heard it. Caleb, my brother. We hadn't spoken since the night the clinic shut down, since the fight, since everything fell apart. He'd stayed in the city, picked up the pieces, moved on. I'd come here instead, into the woods, into silence. That he even knew I was fostering again meant word had spread, and fast, probably through Marla. Black Hollow was small. Its roots went deep and tangled through everyone's life like old ivy. That same morning, I noticed a second car parked down the road near the forest's edge. A gray SUV with out-of-town plates, idling long enough to be more than just lost hikers. It was gone by the time I walked over, but the tread in the mud was fresh, clean, and deliberate. Not the type of visitor who meant well. I didn't mention it to Marla when she checked in later, but something in her eyes told me she already knew something was off. "You've stirred the hive," she muttered as she cleaned Sage's crusted eyes. "Some people don't like others taking in strays. Makes them feel judged." Later that night, a message popped up on my old vet school alumni forum. Someone had posted anonymously in a thread titled, "When do you stop trying to save everything?" It wasn't just a philosophical debate. It was a pointed echo. There were references, too specific, too sharp, to the case that broke me years ago. A kitten I couldn't save, a mistake I never talked about. Someone knew, someone remembered, and they weren't done whispering about it. The pressure mounted from all sides, ghosts of the past, old wounds cracked open, and now the very real possibility that someone was watching. I tried to stay present, to focus on the kittens. Juniper had started walking, wobbly but determined, her paws too big for her frame. Ash hissed less. Birch purred when stroked. Sage, still sick, leaned into my hand like it was the only warmth in the world. They needed me. Not some version of me, buried under the weight of a ruined past. Me, now. But the outside world wasn't going to stay out much longer. The rescue wasn't just mine anymore. It was becoming a story. One I hadn't agreed to tell, but one that, ready or not, I was already trapped in. I started sleeping on the floor next to the fireplace. Not because the bed was uncomfortable or the cabin too cold, but because that space, the rug littered with folded towels, bottles, medication syringes, and tiny curled bodies, felt more real than the rest of my life. Every night, I'd listen to the soft breathing of the kittens, the way Juniper's tiny paws twitched in dreams, the soft sighs that escaped from Sage's feverish sleep. There was a strange comfort in the routine, in the fragile responsibility of being needed without question. It made me feel less like a man undone, and more like someone who might still be stitched together. But slowly, the edges of comfort began to fray. I caught myself thinking about permanence, what it would mean to keep them, all four. I tried to picture the months ahead, vet bills, behavioral challenges, the socialization needed, the time. Could I do that here alone? Was I even allowed to try again? My past failures clung to my skin like old smoke. Every time I held Juniper to my chest and felt her purr like a distant engine coming to life, I felt that terrible split. The part of me that wanted to give her everything, and the part that whispered, "You couldn't even save the last one." Marla returned the next day, bringing more meds and a carrier just in case. She saw the weight on my face before I even said a word. "You know you don't have to be the end point," she said, kneeling beside Birch. "You're allowed to be the bridge." I stared at her, the words catching me off guard. The bridge. I'd never thought of myself that way. I'd always believed rescue meant keeping, healing meant holding on. But what if it didn't? What if healing sometimes meant handing over? Still, the thought of letting them go, letting Juniper go, burned. She'd grown stronger by the day, no longer fragile but determined. She explored the room now, tumbling over pillows and pouncing clumsily on Marla's laces. She came when I called. She knew my scent. She slept with her paw against my wrist, like a thread that refused to fray. How could I bridge her into someone else's life when she'd become so tangled in mine? That evening, Caleb called again. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail. "I remember what it did to you, Eli. I remember that kitten, but this time doesn't have to end the same. You just have to know what you want from this, not what you owe." That word, "owe," sank deep. I wasn't sure if I was saving these kittens because I could, or because I was still trying to pay off a debt that no one had asked me to carry. Somewhere in that question I knew was the truth I'd been running from. The kittens didn't need a martyr. They needed someone honest enough to decide what love really meant. And I wasn't sure I was ready to answer that. The wind shifted on the seventh night. It came howling down from the cliffs, wild and sudden, snapping branches and rattling the windows like a warning. I was up late, sitting by the fire, trying to convince Sage to eat something more than 2 sips of formula. He'd lost weight again. His breathing had grown shallow. The meds weren't kicking in fast enough. I was trying not to panic, trying to hold that edge of calm that had become my armor, but I knew what fading looked like, and Sage was slipping. The sound of gravel crunching snapped me out of it. Headlights spilled through the windows, white and sharp and sudden. A car, then a second. I stepped onto the porch with Juniper in my arms, her tiny claws digging gently into my flannel, and watched as the gray SUV returned, this time with company. A black truck I didn't recognize, tires wide and tires muddy. The kind of truck that didn't just drive through Black Hollow, it meant to. 2 men stepped out, one tall, one stocky, and stood in the driveway, not saying a word. I didn't know them, but I knew the type. Clean boots, rough hands, long stares. They were local enough to blend in, but not from here. One of them finally spoke. "We're looking for the man who took in the kittens." His voice was flat, unbothered, as if this were a perfectly normal conversation to be having on someone's private property in the middle of the night under the threat of a storm. I told him that was me. I didn't flinch. Juniper's heartbeat was fluttering fast against my ribs. She knew. Animals always do. "We lost a litter up the mountain," he said. "Someone said they might have wandered this way. Breeder stock, not yours." That last bit, "not yours," landed like a rusted nail. I didn't answer. He took a step closer. "We'd like to look at them." My silence was a refusal. I didn't care if they were breeders or sellers or men who just didn't like questions. The way he said it, like they were property, like they were lost tools instead of lives, ignited something old and hot in me. Marla pulled into the drive 10 minutes later, tires skidding in the mud. She stepped out fast, coat half buttoned, and inserted herself between me and them like she'd done it before. "Unless you've got a warrant," she said calmly, "you're not seeing anything." They didn't argue. They just stared, long enough to leave a threat in the air. Then they drove off, engines growling into the trees, leaving behind a silence that was anything but peaceful. Back inside, the kitten stirred restlessly. Sage whimpered in his sleep. Birch had begun limping on one leg. Juniper wouldn't let go of my shirt. I sat there for hours, watching the shadows crawl up the walls, the fire burning low, my body frozen in a quiet, seething tension. This wasn't just about rescue anymore. Something bigger had walked into the room, and it had every intention of staying. The storm finally broke in the early morning, lashing against the cabin with a violence that felt strangely appropriate. I sat by the window in the dim orange glow of the firelight, holding Juniper in one hand and Caleb's old voicemail in the other, just playing it again, listening to the pauses, the regret folded between the words. I hadn't called him back, not yet, because hearing his voice made everything feel unfinished. Because the last time we stood in the same room, a kitten had died, and neither of us had known how to grieve it. Behind me, Sage coughed, a small, rattling sound that felt too heavy for his frame. I checked his temperature again. Still high. I doubled his fluids. Birch, curled beside him, nuzzled gently against his neck, as if trying to share something of her own strength. Ash was pacing again, restless and sharp-eyed. Juniper kept trying to climb my sleeve, pawing up toward my face as if reminding me that no matter how bad things got, she was still here, still asking for presents, still fighting. Marla came by again at noon. She brought stronger antibiotics for Sage and a map, folded and stained at the corners. "These guys aren't amateurs," she said. "They've been on the radar for a while. Backyard breeding, unlicensed sales. The mother cat might have escaped from one of their trailers after the storm, or maybe she was dumped when she stopped producing." Her tone was even, but I could feel the tightness in her hands as she unfolded the paper. "They've got cages out there. Elias, a setup. Probably more cats still out in the wild." She paused, eyes flicking over me. "You want to do something about it?" I didn't answer her right away. I just looked down at Juniper, now sleeping in the crook of my arm, and thought about how something so small had managed to tilt my whole world off its axis. But maybe that was what I'd needed. Maybe she hadn't just shown up to be rescued. Maybe she'd come to remind me that hiding from what broke you doesn't heal a damn thing. So I told Marla yes, I'd help. I'd go out there, whatever that meant. That afternoon, I set up a second heat lamp and rearranged the sleeping area. I placed Birch and Ash beside Sage, who still struggled to keep warm. They nuzzled against him like they'd known each other forever. That unspoken language, how animals heal by simply being close, felt like something humans forgot too easily. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. Juniper, still the smallest and weakest of them all, climbed from her basket and curled up against Sage's side. No noise, no hesitation, just a small, deliberate press of her body into his, like she was offering him part of what little she had left. It made my throat tighten. That gesture, quiet, instinctive, unselfish, felt like the purest form of what I'd been trying to find in myself. Connection doesn't need to be grand. Sometimes it's just being brave enough to stay when everything says you should run. The wind had stripped most of the autumn leaves from the trees by the time we found the cages. It was 3 days after the storm, and Marla had spent every spare hour tracing rumors, offhand comments from farmers, half-heard whispers in town. The place was half a mile up a fire trail behind the cliffs, masked by brush and deliberate neglect. We found it just before sundown. 4 rusted kennels, 2 collapsed crates, and a broken shed with a tarp nailed across the frame. The stench hit first: urine, wet hay, fear. In the shadows, 3 cats bolted when they heard us coming. But inside one of the cages there was another, small, gray, skin pulled too tight over her bones. Her ears were torn. Her left paw bent at an unnatural angle. She didn't hiss, she didn't move, just stared. We didn't talk, we just acted. By the time we loaded the final cage into the back of Marla's truck, the sun had dipped below the tree line. We brought them all to her facility, just 4 survivors, but I carried the little gray one in my lap. She didn't fight, just leaned into the warmth like it was the only real thing left. That night, I sat in the back of the truck long after Marla went inside, the rain beginning to fall again, soft and quiet and steady. I looked down at her and felt that familiar ache rise, the one I'd spent years learning how to ignore, the one that said, "You can't save them all. But you always try, don't you?" Back at the cabin, the energy had shifted. The kittens were stronger. Birch now climbed the furniture like she owned the place. Ash had discovered the joy of destroying socks, and even Sage, fragile as he still was, had begun to respond to touch with a slow, trusting blink. But it was Juniper who surprised me most. She no longer needed warmth every hour. She played now. She ran, tripping over her own paws, then climbed back up again, stubborn and wild, which made the decision even harder. Marla had found placements, safe, loving foster homes, handpicked. She even offered to keep Sage herself. "They'll be cared for," she told me. "This doesn't have to be goodbye, just not all at once." But every part of me rebelled at the idea. Giving them up felt like losing something I hadn't known I needed. These kittens had become more than rescues. They were mirrors, stories with beating hearts that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond regret. That night, I sat on the rug with all 4 of them curled around me, and for the first time in years, I let the silence ask the question out loud. Was I doing this for them or for me? There was no answer yet, but I knew this. Whatever choice I made next would change all of us. There was no undoing what had already been written into the skin of this story. The next morning came heavy with the scent of frost. I stepped outside barefoot, coffee steaming in one hand, the hush of early light spilling over the treetops like a secret trying to keep itself. Inside, the kittens stirred. I could hear Juniper's paw pads padding across the floorboards, her little nails clicking against the wood as she chased something invisible. That sound used to make me smile. Now it only tightened the knot in my chest. Marla showed up earlier than usual. She didn't say much, just walked through the door with that determined calm of hers, holding a set of small carriers lined with soft towels and gentle inevitability. I didn't move. Neither did the kittens. Somehow they knew. Even Juniper, usually first to greet her with a curious pounce, just sat behind my leg watching, waiting. "I can take them today?" Marla said after a long silence, her voice kind but firm. "All 4. We've got the homes lined up. The Fosters are ready. Good people." I nodded. It was the kind of nod that meant nothing, yet said everything. I knew this was the right path. I knew letting them go gave them the best chance at lives beyond the edge of these woods. But still, my body rebelled. My voice caught somewhere behind my ribs. Marla sighed. "You don't have to make this harder than it already is." "I know," I whispered. We stood there for a long time, the air between us taut like wire, stretched by all the things we couldn't say. Finally, she stepped closer and crouched beside Juniper. "You did something good, Elias," she said. "You brought them this far. That counts." "Does it?" I asked, and my voice came out more bitter than I meant it to. "Feels like I'm just giving them up." She looked at me then, hard and full of that quiet, uncomfortable truth. "That's not what you're doing. You're choosing to give them something better. That's the hardest kind of love there is." We packed the carriers slowly. Birch and Ash went in first, hissing and scrabbling at the soft mesh before settling into each other like puzzle pieces. Sage followed, quieter now, his illness waning, his small eyes blinking slowly up at me like he already knew I couldn't keep him safe forever. Then came Juniper. She didn't resist, didn't fight, just walked into the carrier and turned once before sitting down facing me, her tiny face calm, her eyes knowing, and that broke me. I turned away, jaw tight, breath sharp, staring at the grain in the floor like it could offer answers. "I can't keep her," I muttered, "but I don't know how to let her go." Marla waited, then said quietly, "Maybe it's not about letting go. Maybe it's about trusting she knows what to do next." I walked them out to the truck myself, watched as the doors shut, watched the brake lights disappear down the road that curved away from me like a choice I'd just made but didn't yet understand. And when the silence returned, it was no longer empty. It was full of memory and motion and something that felt like forgiveness. The cabin was too quiet after they left. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind that echoes. The kind that follows you from room to room, no matter how many lights you turn on or how many mugs of coffee you leave half-finished on the counter. I found myself still crouching by the fire out of habit, looking over at the place where their bedding had been, half expecting to see Juniper's smoky little form curled into a ball. But there was only the pattern of the rug, worn, uneven, empty. Outside, the forest had returned to its normal rhythm, wet needles underfoot, the occasional crack of a limb falling, birdsong too distant to be comforting. I took walks with no purpose, down to the creek and back, through the thickets behind the cedar tree where Wren was buried. I checked the trap cameras Marla had installed near the edge of the woods. No sign of intruders, no more boot tracks. But I didn't feel safe. I felt unmoored. That night, I sat with my phone in my lap for over an hour before I finally hit call. Caleb answered on the third ring. I didn't know what to say at first, and neither did he. But the silence between us was different from the silence in the cabin. It had a pulse, a heartbeat trying to remember itself. "You did it, didn't you?" he asked eventually. "I did. And," I swallowed, "I don't know yet." We talked for a long time. About Sage, about the others, about Juniper, about how I hadn't known I still had the capacity to care like that, about how terrifying it was to feel anything that deeply again. He listened, mostly. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You could come back, you know. There's a clinic up here. Small, quiet. You wouldn't be doing surgeries, just rehab cases. Kittens, mostly." I laughed, short, raw. "You think they want me back? After what happened? You're the only one who hasn't forgiven yourself, Eli." That hit harder than I wanted it to. And for the first time in years, I didn't argue. After we hung up, I opened the small wooden box I'd kept buried in the back of my closet. Inside was a photo of the kitten I'd lost back then, Kip. Gray and white, big ears, soft eyes. He'd only lived 9 days after I tried to treat him. The mistakes I made weren't malicious, just misjudged. But that had been enough to end everything: school, relationships, my sense of worth. I'd been trying to atone ever since. But maybe Juniper wasn't meant to be penance. Maybe she'd never been about Kip at all. Maybe she was about what came after guilt, after grief. I closed the box gently and placed it back where it belonged, not hidden this time, just resting. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked into my screen door. No name, no return address, just a single photograph inside. Juniper, sitting in a sunlit windowsill, bigger now, healthy, watching birds through the glass with a soft, curious face. On the back, someone had written, "She waits for you." The road out of Black Hollow curved like a question I'd been avoiding for years, winding through pine groves and mist-veiled meadows, past the slow-breathing silhouette of the mountain that had always stood watch over my silence. I drove with the windows cracked just enough to let the wind in, the scent of damp bark and cold stone pressing through the cab like a memory that refused to stay buried. The photo of Juniper lay folded on the passenger seat, the ink on the back soft from the oils of my hands, those 5 words still echoing in my head with a weight that felt both like an invitation and a challenge. She waits for you. The city didn't feel like home, not yet, not again, but it didn't reject me either. The buildings stood where they always had, sun-glinted glass and weathered brick rising like old companions who didn't ask questions about the years you'd lost. I found the clinic off a side street near the river, nestled between a used bookstore and a quiet little bakery with hand-painted signs in the window. It wasn't the place I remembered from school. It was smaller, warmer, lived in. The kind of place where animals got a second chance, not just the ones on 4 legs, but the ones with names like mine too. Caleb was waiting by the door, coffee in one hand, eyes shaded by something older than forgiveness. We didn't speak for a long time. He just nodded toward the glass door and said, "She's in the back. They just finished her checkup. No issues." I followed him down the hallway, my boots clicking against tile, the walls lined with photos of adopted cats and thank you notes scribbled in crooked handwriting from kids who probably never knew the weight of what rescue really meant. And then I saw her. Juniper had changed, but only in the ways that time blesses the lucky. Her legs had grown out, slender and strong, her coat now a rich smoke gray with soft silver lacing her spine. She didn't flinch when she saw me. She didn't hesitate. She leapt down from her perch with the same quiet confidence she'd had as a trembling orphan on my chest, walked straight across the room, and pressed her head into my palm like no time had passed at all. In that moment, everything I had fought against, the guilt, the fear, the belief that love was only safe if it came with conditions, burned away like fog in morning sun. I knelt there with her for what felt like an hour, my hand curled around her as if to remind us both that this, somehow, had been the point of it all. Not saving her, not redeeming myself, but finding something, someone worth returning to. Juniper purred softly against my fingers, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man who had lost too much. I felt like someone who had finally come back, not to a place, but to himself. It's strange how the heart keeps records in places the mind can't reach, how the sound of a kitten's breathing in the early hours of the morning, or the warmth of a small body curled against your chest, can stitch closed wounds you thought were permanent. Since bringing Juniper home, I've started living in time again. Not in the future I was always afraid of failing, or in the past that kept dragging me back into its storm, but in the slow, deliberate now. She lives here with me again, stretched long across the back of the couch, her tail flicking lazily at birds she'll never chase, the morning sun warming her fur while the world outside turns quietly towards spring. The others found their homes. Birch, full of cautious sweetness, lives with a retired teacher named Hazel, who writes long letters about how he won't sleep unless the radio's on. Ash, bold and feral-hearted, ended up with a family on the coast, where he watches seagulls from the deck and knocks over flower pots just to be seen. Even Sage, despite those long, dark days, pulled through. He lives with a young couple who said they never believed in second chances until he climbed onto their shoulders and purred like he belonged there. Marla still visits. She brings stories of the ones still being found, under porches, behind sheds, trapped in storm drains, born into silence and smoke. But we don't talk about guilt anymore. Not hers, not mine. Instead, we talk about what's possible. What happens when you give something your time, your attention, your breath, and let it become more than a problem to fix. Rescue isn't about saving, it's about staying, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I've taken up work at the new clinic in town, just part-time, just enough to feel useful again. I spend mornings prepping cases and evenings writing notes in the margins of patient charts, the way I used to when I thought the world could be mended with enough care and caffeine. It turns out the world can't be fixed, but it can be carried. And sometimes, that's enough. There's a photo of Kip on my shelf now, framed beside one of Juniper, older, wiser, still waiting for me at the window each night when I come home. I no longer look at that first photo with shame. I see a boy who tried, who loved something so much he didn't know how to let go, even when he had to. I think he'd be proud of the man I've become. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of all this, that some rescues aren't loud. They don't arrive with headlines or heroics. They come softly, one heartbeat at a time, through every decision to keep showing up when it would be easier not to. Juniper just stretched out in the last rays of sun, blinking up at me like she already knows the ending. And maybe she does. If this story stayed with you, if something in Juniper's journey echoed a piece of your own, take a moment to breathe that in. Rescue isn't always about the animals. Sometimes it's about the people who find themselves in the act of saving something small and fragile. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Maybe you've carried something too. Guilt, grief, a quiet love you never knew what to do with. Let this be your reminder. It's never too late to come back to yourself. If you believe in second chances, for animals, for people, for the parts of you that still hurt, then stay with us. Subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and come back for the next one. Because every rescue holds a deeper story, and you never know when yours might begin. Until then, take care of the quiet things, and take care of yourself.